Now that we've created the virtual switch, I'm set to create my virtual machine. So I'm going to select New under the Actions pane on the right-hand side of the screen, and I will choose Virtual Machine. This gives me the new virtual machine wizard. In this wizard, on the Before You Begin, I'm just going to click Next. The first question is, what do you want to name the virtual machine? I'm going to name this File Server 2016. Now, this is not the name of the operating system we're installing. Instead, this is the name of the virtual machine. The only place you will see this name reflected is in the Hyper-V server itself, in this Hyper-V manager. So that's going to be the name of the virtual machine. I'm going to click Next for that. It asks me here on the specified generation if I want a Generation 1 or Generation 2 virtual machine. A Generation 1 virtual machine is for older operating systems. Windows XP 2003, 2008. With the Generation 1 virtual machines, I can run older operating systems, and I can also run 32-bit operating systems, as it says here, along with 64-bit operating systems. So that's more of an older setting. Generation 2 virtual machines are for newer operating systems. To create a Generation 2 virtual machine, the OS that I'm about to install has to be Windows Server 2012 or newer. On the client side, it has to be Windows 8 or newer, can't be Windows 7 or Vista or any of those older operating systems. And it also has to be a 64-bit operating system. Some of the advantages of this Generation 2 virtual machine is I can boot from a SCSI virtual drive. I can also use this UEFI-based firmware. That's a type of BIOS setting that lets me use Secure Boot and gives me many security benefits that you don't get in a Generation 1 virtual machine. So normally, you want to choose a Generation 2 virtual machine if you're installing a 64-bit OS and it's Server 2012 or newer, Windows 8 or newer. You'd always want to create a Generation 2 virtual machine. However, once you create this virtual machine, notice this warning at the bottom. Once a virtual machine has been created, you cannot change its generation. So you have to be sure you're installing the correct OS. Otherwise, you'd have to delete this and completely start over. I'm going to choose a Generation 2 machine. The assigned memory. Here I can define if I want to use dynamic memory. Dynamic memory simply sets a minimum and maximum amount of memory, and depending on how much memory your machine actually needs, it simply scales up and down as its memory usage demand increases or decreases. Dynamically adjust that. Here I'm going to click Use Dynamic Memory. In addition to that, it also lets me specify startup memory. How much RAM do I want to dedicate to this machine to use when it starts up? It defaults to 1 gig, or 1024 megabytes, which is 1 gig. I'm going to leave that with that 1 gig of RAM, 1024 megabytes. Both of those are easily changed after the fact in the virtual machine properties. We'll see that in a moment. So I'm going to choose Next on the assigned memory. The previous section, we looked at virtual switches. This always defaults to Not Connected for a virtual switch. If I click the drop down, you get a list of every virtual switch on your machine. The virtual switch I created in the previous lesson, I named Private. I'm going to click that Private virtual switch here. So that's the virtual switch that this machine will communicate on. We'll choose Next for that. The virtual hard disk that I can connect. This always defaults to creating a new virtual hard disk. So right now, this is going to create a virtual hard drive. That virtual hard drive has the name of the machine. I named my virtual machine in the beginning of this wizard, File Server 2016. This will create a virtual hard drive with that name, and it adds a .vhdx extension. So that's the extension and format of our virtual hard drives. The location that virtual hard drive will be saved to, and the size of that hard drive. You'll see I can have a maximum of 64 terabytes when I size that drive. But I'm going to leave this on 127 gigs. If I had created a virtual machine on another computer and I simply wanted to move it from one Hyper-V server to another, there is an option to use an existing virtual hard disk. This would simply let me browse out and choose another drive. I also have the option to attach a virtual hard disk later if you want to come back and do this at another time. Here, I am going to create a new virtual hard disk. So the top option, create a virtual hard disk. Next for that. So the last configuration is the installation option. I could say I want to install an operating system later. I could browse out for an ISO file if I wanted to install the operating system now. Just browse to the location you saved it to. There's also an option, install an operating system from a network-based installation server. That would assume that I have another machine set up somewhere on the network that deploys all of my operating systems. Now, I could browse out for an ISO file now, but I want to show you how to do that after this has been created. So I'm going to choose Install an Operating System Later. We'll click Next and Finish. My virtual machine has now been created. In the next section, I'm going to show you how to actually install the operating system, and we'll look at many of the settings of the virtual machine.